Well, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for a discussion of this cycle's big gay read, The 57 Bus. Now, before we get into a little bit about the book and we get into more about what the big gay read is, I'd like to introduce our guests today, or rather have them introduce themselves. So, Carolyn, welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
So I work at the Dispute Resolution Center, and I help set up community circles, restorative justice circles, sometimes mediations, things like that, as an alternative form of dispute resolution for folks.
We're also joined by Dr. Jennifer Tang. How are you, Jennifer?
I'm good. Good to see everyone. Yes. Hi, I'm Jennifer. I am a counseling psychologist and also the founder and director of Everwell Health and Counseling Services here in Ann Arbor and also servicing all of Michigan. And so we focus on providing diversity affirming and culturally sensitive counseling care that's also rooted in evidence-based therapy practices. So helping individuals with both emotional and mental health and emotional well-being.
Thank you guys so much for joining us, and thank you so much for interacting with this book. A little bit about the Big Gay Read. So here at the library, we wanted the community to interact with queer issues, and one way that we thought we could do that is through books. So our first Big Gay Read was about 6 months ago. In this one, we chose the 57 Bus. I'd like to give a little summary of the book for those who are haven't picked up the book yet, have just skimmed the book a little bit, just so we're all a little bit on the same page here. And it is also an impossible book to summarize. It is amazing how much the author fits into these 300 pages. So here's my attempt. So two teens riding home from school on the 57 bus in Oakland, California. One of these teens is named Sasha, who identifies as agender, and they were wearing a skirt on the public bus. 16-year-old Richard, who is a Black male, who was egged on by his friends in a whirlwind moment, sets Sasha's skirt on fire on the bus. Now, the fire left third-degree burns over 22% of Sasha's body, and Richard was charged as an adult with 2 hate crimes and faced life in prison. This book is their story, and it's told from their two experiences, and we get to see how their experiences interact with one another. And really, the book is about race, it's about non-binary genders, it's about forgiveness, it's about family, it's about community, it's about schools. So we hope that when you interact with this book, you see a little bit of our community in it as well. So yes, I think we're a good place to start this discussion, and something that the book does a wonderful job of kind of laying out for us is, why did Richard do what he did? And rather, how can we as a community prevent incidences like the one that happened on the 57 bus from happening? Do you guys have any ideas about
that? Sure. So I listened to part of this book with my kids, and I'm really glad I did, because they had some really great insight when I was thinking about these questions. And the first thing that came to mind with this one was, you can't prevent incidents like this. That's impossible. Things like this will always happen, right? What we can come up with 1,000 ways to prevent them, and every time there will be new ways to cause harm. So in order to actually prevent harm like this from happening, we have to look at why it happened. So restorative justice does that. It takes that sort of perspective. It looks at incidents of harm with a wide lens. When someone causes harm to another person, there are layers to that impact that it may have had. And so in the book, for example, Sasha said that once the physical pain passed, they didn't feel really any more emotional repercussions. They felt pretty okay. And so for them, the support of the community around them was enough to help them feel secure enough to move on. However, we saw that other people in their life, like Andrew, had strong, long-lasting emotional reactions, despite not even having been present at the incident. what that shows is that, harm and bullying it's more than just like the actions of one or two people. It almost always affects more than just the victim. Usually there's unaddressed trauma, there's basic needs not being met, there's a disconnect from something important. There's the saying that hurt people, and that's true. So I think the first thing that we can do is examine our own involvement in the systems and ways of thinking that allow bullying and harm to take place. Have we examined our own biases? Have we given thought to how those might manifest in our words and actions? What do we need to unlearn? Like, do we recognize what makes us fearful, right? Because that can cause reactions. So if we can't first own our own behaviors, then we can't help other people to do so. And then we also, after that, have to think about if we want to help people. Help is a very personal and individual concept, right? We can't just use the same tool for everyone. We have to talk to people. What could be harmful to me would be helpful to someone else. So we have to be prepared to have those difficult conversations and to understand where others are coming from, which is one of the things I love about restorative justice, right? It allows those conversations to take place. And then as a community, we have to take accountability for the flaws in our system. We have to empower victims. The people who have been harmed. We have to ask for what they need in order to feel safe. And then our communities need to give people who caused harm a chance to take responsibility for their actions, make amends, change their behavior. So that, that means they're held accountable, but also the community. We need to hold ourselves accountable for the circumstances that made those choices preferable to other choices.
Wow. And a response I had when I was listening to you is what you just described, I feel like rarely occurs in a courtroom.
Yeah.
For those of people who are listening and watching this might be their first time hearing the term restorative justice. Can you tell us a little bit more about what restorative justice is and what it looks like in practice?
Yeah. So in the book, Slater referred to Sujata Baliga, who is very well known in the field of restorative justice. And so I really like this quote of hers. I'm going to read that if that's okay. She says, "In our current system of justice, particularly with regard to criminal harm, we ask a very specific set of questions when we're confronted with harm. What law was broken, who broke it, and how do we punish them? The paradigm shift that restorative justice calls us to is a very different set of questions. It starts with who was harmed, what do they need, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs? So the primary focus is on the crime victim. The initial focus is how the crime victim defines the harm themselves. That is inherently incredibly empowering." So that's her quote, which I think really puts the idea into focus. It takes away from having the focus be the law and having the focus be the person who was harmed.
It is, I really refrain from using this word because it certainly has its connotations, but that's a radical notion, right? Moving from how do we punish this person and pivoting to what does the victim need? I think there's a wonderful part in the book where we see restorative justice used in a school setting, in which one of the male students was slapping his female classmates' butts. And how they went about rectifying that situation is they brought everybody who was affected and the person who was doing the affecting into a room, and they were able to talk about their feelings. When you did that to me, it made me feel. Yep. And the person who was doing the slapping went, well, whoa, I didn't think I was doing that. I thought I was just being silly and stupid. And they're like, you are being silly and stupid and you're hurting my feelings, making me feel uncomfortable. And I think that if we can see kids doing that, I think that we as adults can do that too.
One of the things I really love about the restorative justice process is that it doesn't have to be used only in serious cases, right? Because the process centers the voices and experiences of the people involved and tailors that result based on what their needs are, it can be used to address all sorts of things, small conflicts to much larger ones.
Yes. Do you see?
So powerful. Sorry. I
No,
was just
go
thinking,
ahead.
like, I'm just hearing you both talk, and this is new to me hearing about restorative justice in this framework, but it's so similar to a lot of things when working with individuals in general, and especially with youth, right? Especially when a teenager comes to therapy, for example, people point out the behavior, there's like, oh, they're doing this terrible behavior, they're not going to school, or they're bullying their younger sibling, whatever, and we're only so hyper focused on the behavior itself and punishing that or stopping that, rather than kind of thinking like what's kind of at the root cause of the behavior itself. What are the things that might be influencing that individual, whatever. And Carolyn, you brought up kind of the systemic kind of influences too as a community, right? Like what are the things kind of going around them that are also kind of shaping some of this going on. So I really think that's a great lens in which to kind of look at anything.
Yes. And at least in my own experience in therapy, not to get too personal, but between my therapist and I, there's some overlap in the Venn diagram of therapy and restorative justice, insofar as I'm kind of restoring what's going on inside of me, which is an interesting notion. I also kind of see the book as itself, from page 1 to the end, as restorative justice. All these things are laid out to us, and we see how what the victim needed, and we see it from all these different angles. So it's really cool to think of reading the book as an act of restorative justice as well. Something that I had mentioned earlier and that I would love to explore more is, why did Richard do this? And I think something that the book discusses is the science behind the adolescent brain. So why are adolescent brains prone to making these decisions that are so clearly terrible decisions that harm other people? What's that all about?
Yeah. I guess to kind of give a little bit of a neuroscience lesson. So there's different parts of our brain, and they all have kind of different functions or have very different primary jobs. So there's a part of the brain called the amygdala, right? That's kind of the more instinct-driven part of our brain. And so it's the part of the brain that experiences and regulates emotions, and also is associated with our fight or flight response. So hopefully, for those who don't know fight or flight response, it's basically a very primal, like survival instinct, right? Like we saw a bear, do we fight, do we flight, type of thing. So that's kind of the amygdala. However, the part of our brain that's called the prefrontal cortex, that's the part of the brain that deals with like planning, decision making, thinks through like consequences, impulse control, so complex behavior, like I can't do A until I do B, or even like consequences, right? Like if C happens, if I do C, then D will happen. However, the prefrontal cortex research has found is not fully developed until adulthood. And I was looking it up, and it looks like it's not even fully developed until closer to 25 years old. So what's interesting is you could have an amazing student, right? Like, oh, well, my kid's a straight A student. Does really great on test scores, great SAT scores. Why did they do this behavior? And the research has indicated that, like, yeah, as an adult, we use a different part of our brain, right? You're using our prefrontal cortex when making decisions, when we're acting, because we're able to think through those long-term consequences on things. Whereas a teenager is more likely to be using that amygdala, right? That's the part of the brain that's very instinct-driven. It's also very responsive to like emotions. So if they're in a perceived experience of stress, they're more likely to do something more rash, right? And so this is why probably when you're talking with a teenager, like, why did you do that? What were you thinking? And the challenge is that maybe they weren't thinking, right? They were using more of the feeling aspect to drive their behavior. So that's a little bit of just the context, I guess, of our different brain development. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think for a lot of people, that would be an unsatisfying answer. Why did Richard do what he did? What was he thinking? Well, he wasn't. And there's a scientific reason for that. And it's that kind of unsatisfying gray area that this book hammers home, and really highlights. Um, knowing knowing the science that we know, knowing the science that you just described, I have a hard time understanding why a large number of young people, um, primarily young Black men, are tried as adults in court. Um, I would be interested to hear from you guys. What does that say about our society that kids, we often choose to try them as adults, mostly when they're Black men? What do you guys do? How do you react to that?
I react to it similarly to how I think we need to deal with, any kind of harm that's caused, right? It starts with our own self-reflection and then looks at community accountability, right? So speaking as a very white presenting person, we need to accept and that whether we like it or not, we live in, participate, and contribute to a racist society that does racist things, like convict Black kids at a much higher rate than white kids. That's not a personal failing, it's a fact. And recognizing that we are integrated into a system that does bad things does not automatically make us a bad person. But we have an individual responsibility to recognize the harms that our systems cause and look at how our biases may lead us to ignore some things, focus on other things, or inadvertently harm people, because that happens. We all harm other people at some point. And as a community, then we need to engage. We need to change with how we engage with young people who have done harm. We owe them a chance to learn and grow and set things right when they've done something harmful. We owe the young people who have experienced harm a chance to find real accountability in a way that feels safe and right for them. And communities should be working to give kids the tools that they need to succeed, not just the tools we think they need to succeed, right? We need to listen to them and have those conversations.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. Again, that shift, right? Rather than kind of seeing it as, I actually don't know how the legal system works, but my guess is they're like based on the severity of the crime is when they like try them as adults or something, right? Rather than kind of thinking through like, okay, are they actually functioning as an adult? But again, it's focused on just that particular behavior. And again, I really like what Carolina was saying about like, looking at it from the community-wide circumstance, right? Like, what are the things that we can do? Because so much of the time, again, we're very individualistic in our society where it's like, okay, well, that person did something wrong, they should be penalized. And it's not about me issue, rather than thinking it's like, what are things that we can kind of do? How can we help and better kind of educate ourselves or unlearn certain behaviors or those kinds of things to create more kind of system-wide changes.
Oof. And if the first step to understanding is self-reflection, I can think about people in my life who have no ability to reflect on themselves or their actions. What advice would you have for somebody who wants to start practicing self-reflection? How does somebody build that muscle? Kind of a gnarly question, I know.
Yeah, I think there's no kind of one size fits all for that. But, I think that what I think has been really interesting to see, though, is this kind of shift, even in these last few years, where people kind of are embracing counseling, individual mental health counseling, right, as a space to kind of be able to kind of explore and better understand and unpack some of the things that we've learned and has shaped our behavior and our thinking patterns, or even as a space to like have that intentional time to like self-reflect, right? Certainly you can do it on your own, right? Sometimes people they like to journal or have certain prompts. You can probably find lots of either things online or books right there, just to kind of get yourself to kind of self-reflect, because it seemingly seems silly, right? Like, what does this mean to self-reflect? But it can be so powerful to take a step back. Like, why is it that I think this way? Or why is it that I do this thing? We all kind of assume things just happen, right? But realizing like, oh, okay, like, yeah, maybe it's kind of the type of upbringing I had or the type of schooling that I had that helped me think of things a certain way. Is that what I still want now?
Yeah, I think for, like you said, it's so personal, right? And for me, I have different tools, right? I like to paint or I like to write. Like those are ways that I am able to set aside that time. But I wouldn't even have been doing any of that without therapy to help me like really think about, okay, well, how are you going to use that sort of time to self-reflect and be able to do that? So for me, that's what worked, right? And I love how you're saying that it has to be this personal thing, but also an intentional act that you do.
Mm. Intention. Oof. Now, to switch gears just a little bit, I think another part that explains why Richard did what he did is the different traumas he's experienced as a young person. He has experienced murder, the death of friends, family members because of senseless gun violence. His world is colored by that in a lot of different ways. A question or something that I'd like to explore a little bit of it is what exactly is trauma, and how does trauma affect specifically the adolescent brain?
Yeah. Trauma, I guess, most simply put, right, is anything where you individually experience or someone you're really close to experience that could be extremely life-threatening or emotionally disturbing. So Jacob, you touched on a couple of examples already, but when someone's experiencing, again, a sudden death of a loved one, or physical abuse, or it could be emotional abuse. It could obviously living through war, but it could also be, experiencing ongoing oppression, racism, living in poverty, homelessness could all kind of be experienced as traumatic in our lives, and so trauma also impacts and can have adverse effects on our mental well-being. Could also impact even our way, our interpersonally, how we relate with others, and even things that can happen a long time ago, right? Like I could work with someone, say, in their 60s, but still have been shaped by the trauma they experienced in their childhood. And again, it could be not even something that you experience, right? Like you can experience one of your parents being abused by the other parent, and how that has impact and been traumatic on that individual. And so, again, from more of that, the kind of brain development side of things, right? We talk about like, again, the adolescent brain still kind of being shaped and defined at that point in life, right? And then so much of, especially when you're living through the trauma, that you're still kind of using more of that kind of fight or flight response, right? Like things always, if you are used to, you're kind of being left by a caregiver, right? And finally you live in a home where you've been adopted, let's say, and you're like, why is it that they still feel on edge? They don't feel safe, even though we're like, you're here now, we love you, right? But it's because their brain has been shaped to feel like, okay, the last caregiver, the caregivers I've had before have all abandoned me. And so again, the brain instinctively is trying to protect itself. So it's like, this is not a safe space. And so, but all that to say though too, right, is that our brain is like any other muscle, right? It can be shaped and relearn and that kind of thing. So as much as you think about, like, if we're trying to learn to kick a soccer ball, for example, right, in the beginning it's very clunky, we didn't realize that there's so many other muscles involved to make this work, but the more you do it, right, we call it muscle memory, right, it becomes very streamlined. But similarly, right, like with trauma, our brain has learned this response, right? Like, okay, this is an unsafe environment. I'm always going to be hypervigilant on edge, that there's danger around the corner. But the more we can kind of like work through the trauma in certain ways, and get the supports that we need, we can kind of recognize and relearn, okay, like this is a safe and secure relationship or an individual or environment that I'm in.
And then, so if Richard's brain was shaped by the traumas he's experienced, and we're looking at those traumas as an explanation for the crime he committed, how do we prevent our traumas from creating traumas for others? I don't know if I said that right. Um, how do we prevent our traumas from perpetuating themselves? How do we end the cycle?
Yeah, I mean, like, again, certainly therapy has been very profound in that way, right? Like someone who is able to kind of go seek counseling, particularly that is trauma informed, that either is a space where they can, again, better, there's different ones that are more trauma focused, but really helps them understand, again, how that has shaped them, but then kind of working through, how it's impacting their functioning now, and be able to kind of feel again safe and secure again in that sense, but also there's probably more systemic wide changes that we can do, right? Like if we can better inform agencies and individuals that work with children, youth, and families, right, to better understand, like, okay, how is this impacting, again, the things that we're seeing play out, right? Or even within schools, right? Like sometimes, again, you'll see, I once worked many years ago now with someone who was an 8-year-old who was getting suspended. Like, you don't really think about 8-year-olds getting suspended, but this little 8-year-old, they were like, she's being really aggressive. She throws things at the teachers, right? But thankfully, someone along the way realized, like, okay, just suspending them is not helping them, like having them have, again, an ongoing therapeutic relationship and better understanding the context of, like, okay, wow, here's someone who's struggling. Their family was struggling financially. Their father was incarcerated. There was a lot of traumas that were going on that she had no outlet to be able to kind of like talk through or be supported in that. So obviously there's not an easy quick fix, but some thoughts.
I think that also we need to shift our mindset from expecting there to never be harm to assuming that harm is something that happens, whether we want it to or not. And we will be just as guilty of causing harm as others will be guilty of causing harm to us, right? And so when we look at it that way, I think we can also be more gentle with ourselves and with others and be more open to the sort of help that you were talking about there, right? Going to therapy or reaching out to someone, because everyone is a part of this process. We all experience and create harm, so we should help each other with that.
And when it comes to helping each other with this harm that is inevitable, I think about, from the book, oh my gosh, if I had a memory that was worth a dime, and I've read this book so many times, the school employee, I think her name was Miss Caprice, how she intentionally set up a community for her students and for the people who, for the students who needed help. There was a place for those kids to receive love, dare I say, and also to receive advice and a place to talk. Jennifer, when you were talking about that 8-year-old student, and it took somebody in the school to say, hey, chances are that this student has experienced some sort of trauma. I just want to give a shout out to all the folks doing that work within our schools, because I think, as represented in this book specifically, at the end of the day, kids and people in general just want to be cared for and to care for people and to be loved. I think about when Richard asked Miss Caprice, can I call you mom? She was like, you already got a mom, but like, I can be your aunt. What he was really saying was like, I want to be loved by you and I want to do right by you. And that's something that people would never think when they read Richard set Sasha on fire. I thought that was one of the most powerful parts of the book. There's Richard says quite blatantly, I just want to be good. And it's just like, whew. I think that we all share that. You know what I'm saying? So to take a different view and to take maybe a couple steps back, I would like to hear a little bit about what advice would you have for a family like Sasha's or like Richard's, who are in this process of seeking forgiveness and or giving forgiveness and receiving forgiveness. what advice would you have for a family who might be in that situation?
So before I would give any advice, right, I'd ask them what they need in order to move forward from this, because that'll determine what steps they need to reach, or what steps to take to reach those needs. Because if they want closure and or forgiveness, they may want to try something like a restorative justice process, or they may not. And I say and or because forgiveness is not an automatic thing, nor is it a requirement in restorative justice. It doesn't always happen. It doesn't have to. Some people who experience harm want answers to the questions. Some want to be able to tell the person who caused harm just how much they were hurt. Some people want to know what was going through your mind, right? Some people just want to know what kind of person this was. Sometimes if it's someone you already knew, you just want to know, like, okay, how are we going to interact with each other going forward now that this happened? And some people don't want anything to do with the other person, and that's okay. And so for real closure, we have to listen to what the needs are of the people who were harmed.
Whew.
Oh, so what's interesting in thinking through the question you praised, Jacob, is that, in terms of like being able to kind of forgive someone, I think, again, so often we get caught up in that behavior, like, well, they did this. And again, our brains automatically think for whatever reason, like someone's being malicious, right? Like, you did this to hurt me. Again, scary, of course, anyone experiencing that would be scared. But taking that time to kind of like put ourselves in their shoes, really trying to kind of understand, like, okay, were they really trying to harm me because they wanted me to suffer? What else could be going on? Are they someone that, was just looking, again, this doesn't justify the behavior by any means, but being able to kind of understand, like, okay, they're just being kids, but maybe he was egged on, right, by his friends. So he's looking for some sort of acceptance by his friends to be like, yes, I'm cool, look at me do this. Again, doesn't justify the behavior, but at the same time, hopefully allows you to like soften your heart a little bit, be like, okay, I shouldn't have to like throw this person in jail forever or resent them forever for being the world's most awful person. At least that's like one quick thought that kind of came to my head, trying to be able to see and think through it a little bit from what could be those other possibilities of why the other person might be doing what they're doing.
Excuse me. This softening of the heart that you brought up, something this book makes us do is hold multiple ideas that conflict with one another at the same height, if you will. Yes, Richard set Sasha on fire, but also Richard didn't mean to do that. But did Richard hold a lighter to the skirt? Yes, he did. These things, I could really go on and on, but these three ideas that exist in conflict with one another, in order to understand the story and to really understand what was going on, we have to be able to kind of hold these contradictory things at the same time. Because life isn't, I don't know, life isn't a movie. It's not a TV show. It doesn't all make perfect sense. And by not making perfect sense, that makes perfect sense to me. Life's way too complicated, for tightly, life, you don't get a bow tightly wrapped around your little life at the end. It's not how it works. So this book, I feel like we focus, it is hard not to focus on the crime that is at the center of this book. But this book is about so much more than that. And specifically, it's about a family whose child comes out to them as agender. And if we want this conversation to be a resource for the community, I would like to hear what advice you have for families, parents, and the children who are coming out themselves. What advice would you have for a family who's in a situation similar to Sasha's, where the child comes to them and says, I don't think I'm not really feeling like a boy. I'm not really feeling like a girl. I'm just kind of feeling like Sasha. What advice would you have for a family in that situation?
Yeah, well, Jacob, you touched upon this just a couple of minutes ago. I think we all are looking to feel accepted, cared for, supported, loved for who we are. And so I think that's something to kind of keep in mind, as the parent or caregiver of someone. And it's important to like not try to question them or doubt them, like, are you sure? Or oftentimes people will think like, oh, well, maybe they're just going through a phase, right? They're young, they're figuring out life, it's just a phase, right? That comes off as incredibly dismissive. And so it's so important to kind of be able to kind of validate and acknowledge their feelings, and also what they believe is to be true. Um, I think taking that pause, right, as a parent or caregiver, taking that pause to like just humbly realize and recognize like, wow, like my child is coming out and opening up to me. Like they are inviting me in to helping them pursue their authentic selves. Like that's amazing. They didn't have to share that with you, right? Like you hear people sometimes being like, I can't tell my parents, I can't tell anybody else about this. And so your child's coming to you and opening up to you about this, that they're wanting to see you as a safe place. And they want to, and then they're inviting you in to be like, this is who I really am. This is my authentic self, or I'm trying to pursue what that looks like. I want you to be a part of that. So taking that pause, kind of reflect on that and recognize that, I think is so important. And I think that it's also important to distinguish, like, as if your child's coming forward and saying like, hi, I think I'm agender, or it could be anything, right? I might be transgender, that as the parent or the caregiver, whoever, not to kind of place the burden of education onto your child now, to be like, wait, what is that? Can you explain to me what that means? Can you define what does it mean to be gender fluid? Those kinds of things that you can easily read up yourself on in a book, online, that you should kind of be doing that on your own, right? That things as a parent to show them support is you're going to further educate yourself. And it's different than kind of wanting to, again, humbly, not expecting an answer, but humbly seeing if they're willing to kind of share, like, oh, wow, like, I know this could have been difficult for you to open up with me on. I really appreciate that. Are there other people that may know? Are there other people you don't want me to share this with? Whatever. Like, I think distinguishing, like, not wanting to make your child educate you now about this versus, again, sharing about, if they're willing to, anything personally. But yeah, I think kind of, again, reminding yourself that they're inviting you in, and that's so important. I was talking with someone and they were kind of talking about like, oh, well, someone had asked them like, well, how do I know? What if my kid, are they ever going to be too young? Are they going to too young to really know this, that kind of thing? I think what was really powerful to hear them talk was saying like, there's so much more to gain by supporting them, and there's so much more to lose by denying them, to be like, no, I think there's a phase, like they're a little out of it. They're only like an 8-year-old. What do they know? Right. I mean, there's so much more to gain for the relationship between the parent or the caregiver with the child, in terms of the child feeling supported, their own mental health, all of that, I think. And so, again, it seemingly seems so simple, but really boils down to, like, again, the genuine kind of love and acceptance for who they are. Isn't that what we all want? Like you said, Jacob?
And it sounds like what you're talking about is really setting up a framework that is an example of someone exterior doing what we were talking about later, right? Like that self-reflection. It's someone outside being like, I believe you and what you're experiencing, right? And that's something that the self-reflection is almost doing that with ourselves, right? Like listening to ourselves and letting us believe what it is that is. Like it's creating that framework for a kid, which I think is so beautiful.
Yes. A personal anecdote that I think kind of applies to this is when I came out to my mom, she kind of just, there was no conversation. It was kind of just like, huh, okay. And then the next day, there's a stack of books on the kitchen table, and it's, My Child is Gay. What is gay? Gay, 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 gay. All those titles. And she read these books, and in my head, I'm like, oh man, here we go. What is this about to be? And she was like, okay, I read these books, and like, yeah, no, I totally get it. It makes sense. And I was like, oh, what? Like, I was baffled, but I didn't understand like the work that she put into understanding her child until I was an adult. And I got to know more people and I got to hear their stories and how different they are than that. It's really incredible stuff. In response to what you guys have just said, a question I have is, why is it important that we refer to people by their preferred pronouns? And I think that you guys answered that. When we refer to somebody as their preferred pronouns, and preferred pronouns, it feels silly. It's when we refer to somebody as the pronouns that they are, what we're saying to them is, I see you and I respect you.
Hmm.
You are asking me to refer to you in a specific way to feel comfortable. And as somebody who isn't an evil villain, I would like you to feel comfortable. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. So I'm going to refer to you as you would like to be referred to show you that acceptance. And even if you don't fully understand what is going on with somebody's gender identity, what you do know enough, what you do understand is that you want people to feel comfortable and respected.
Mhm.
So in the meantime, you might need to go to the library and pick up a couple books about pronouns. But in the meantime, you can let that person know that you respect who they are as a human on this planet, walking around doing the same stuff you do by using the pronouns that they are.
Mhm.
And I think that's such a difficult, you see on the news, people are up in arms about pronouns. It's just like, it really is such a small thing you can do to be so respectful. And I think what we want to perpetuate is respect, understanding, and kindness. Even if I don't fully understand, I could go on for days.
But absolutely, I think that, and yeah, I don't know why it should be such a contentious, thing, right? Similar to a name. Like, what is the first thing we do when you say hi? We introduce ourselves, right? Like, our name or what we go by is our identity, how we identify, and also how we go about through this world, right? And so you're saying like, hi, I'm Jennifer, or if I say I'm Dr. Tang, that's my professional side, or whatever. Like, pronouns are an aspect of that, right? It's like how you want others to kind of reference you as. So similarly, like, if someone calls me, hi, Jenny, can I call you Jenny? I'm like, no, I don't go by Jenny, right? The immediate thought is kind of like, that's not who I am, right? Like, it's such a disconnect, right? So to really show that you like really care for them or respect them, like you're saying, or even just acknowledge who they are, it's so important to kind of use the name or the pronouns in which they identify, right? Again, if someone's like, oh, hi, I'm Robert, and you're like, well, can I call you Bob? And you're like, I that's not my name, that's not who I am. So it's to really kind of acknowledge their existence. It should be a simple way of showing that you respect them and acknowledge who they are.
Absolutely. And this goes back to what you guys were discussing about self-reflection. If calling somebody by their pronoun makes me feel miffed, maybe I ought to reflect on why I feel miffed, rather than jumping to the conclusion that I feel miffed because they're wrong.
Yeah.
How can you say that they're wrong? They just told you. Yeah. But I think I hope I don't oversimplify it, because I think that and this is a lesson we learned from the book, it is that simple, and it's also not that simple.
I would want to add to that, because I think sometimes it can go kind of the other way, where someone might accidentally misgender someone, right? And then all of a sudden they go like, oh, he, and you try to correct them. She, oh, so sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm so bad at this. I'm trying to get the hang of it, and they make a big scene, right? I think the main thing is just to say, correct yourself and move on, because then it becomes like that person has to placate you, right? And again, it makes it about them versus about you, well, now I'm making it confusing sounding, but the person, kind of like getting overwhelmed by it, right? Like you're trying to have to placate them. And it's like, no, the person who's trying to say these are my pronouns shouldn't have to placate someone in that sense, right? Because then again, it makes it all about me and I need to work through something. It's like, okay, let's move beyond ourselves is basically the moral of our conversation today.
And people can get locked in that mental prison of, oh my gosh, I keep on messing it up. And in every instance, I mess it up. And you know what? That kind of peeves me off. And that kind of is a pipeline into having a negative feeling about trans and non-binary people. Oh, they make me feel so bad because I can't get their pronouns right. And it's like, oh, that's not really the focus isn't really on as much as it's on. Something I'd like to touch on before we wrap up is Sasha is autistic. I would like to hear from you guys. What would you say to a family who has a neurodivergent child in their family? And for people who might not be too familiar on the topic itself, in what ways does raising a neurodivergent child differ from raising a neurotypical child? And when I say neurotypical and neurodivergent, by neurodivergent, I mean somewhere on the autism spectrum. Key word here being spectrum.
Yeah, I guess to kind of give a little of a background first in terms of like what autism is, again, hard to kind of summarize briefly, but essentially it's a neurological and developmental disorder that affects how a person interacts with others, as well as how they process information in the world around them. The word disorder, though, I don't really like the word disorder because it comes off as more pathologizing. So I think spectrum is a more fitting word. And I think, again, historically, we even in my profession, we would think, oh, autism spectrum, we think of it more of a linear thing, okay, like low functioning versus high functioning autism, or mild, moderate, or severe, or that kind of thing. But what I have found really wonderful, inclusive is the sense of like amongst the autism community, there's more of like a circular typographic, if you can envision. The closest thing is kind of like a pie chart, if you will. But again, there's all these different categories because someone with autism could be very different from someone else with autism. And so kind of imagining kind of these different kind of categories, and then there's these different gradients, in terms of kind of the strengths or challenges for that particular individual, right? It could be like a language or interpersonally or sensory, on these categories. And so I think a more empowering way to see it, because someone may actually, it's not always a deficit, right? Like someone was telling me like their 3-year-old learned to read, and usually you learn to read at like 5 or 6 or later even. So I think that's just a helpful and more encouraging way to understand kind of what that spectrum means. And so, yeah, and thinking about this too, I know someone that is very vocal in sharing about their personal experiences in parenting their autistic son, because they are wanting to share both awareness of what it looks like and also increase just acceptance and all of that. So I think it was great to kind of hear her share. So I'm just kind of relaying her words, in terms of like what we want to tell another parent who's parenting a neurodivergent child, and I think she shared that like basically to kind of remind yourself, right? Like that your child is amazingly and beautifully and perfectly made for who they are, right? And not playing the comparison game, which all of us, I think, we're prone to, right? Like, what is that saying? Is that the comparison is the thief of joy, right? And so it's so important for any of us, any parent, anybody. So not just like if you have a neurodivergent child, but, it was not going to be like, oh, well, why is it my 2-year-old doesn't know how to speak yet? And then here's their classmate is speaking in full sentences, right? Or my child's not able to read yet, and here's someone else reading entire books. But really kind of, again, her advice was to be like to celebrate every milestone, again, not comparing when they happen, but celebrating that, and celebrating all of their strengths, also joining in with them on things that they enjoy doing. So she was saying like her son likes to do what's called scripting. So I guess like reciting their favorite shows. And so her by joining in and doing silly voices, you could see the kid really lit up because he felt connected, right? Again, going back to what we were saying, like all of us just want to feel a sense of connection, a sense of acceptance. And so I think that was, that's just helpful to hear, right? Again, it's nothing drastically that should be different. You know, she does have two children. One is, I guess we could say, is neurodivergent, and one is neurotypical. And they're close in age, both like young elementary school age boys. And she shared like it's not like she has different expectations for either of them. You know, she kind of has the same kind of level of expectations and responsibilities, but being able to kind of recognize like what are their differing needs, what accommodations do they might need to best set them up for success. So I think that was also really encouraging to hear in that way too. Yeah, and I think in terms of like also what can us as a community do right by the neurodivergent community and showing acceptance, right, is similar. I think teaching all of us, but children, I guess, at an early age, and all of us to recognize that like autism, just like any other kind of disability, you know, is not something that's scary. It's not that difference isn't a bad thing, right? Again, thinking about neurodiversity, right? Embracing the diversity and celebrating it. And then in this particular instance, neurodivergent individuals may learn and process and interact with the world differently, and that's okay.
Yeah, I love how you were talking about like focusing on what their needs are, right? Because that like rings very close to the restorative justice model for me, right? And it's this idea that whether someone is neurodivergent or neurotypical, approaching them with that same lens of what do you need? And then it might be something that's very difficult for me to understand, but that becomes a me problem, not a them problem, right? And so then it becomes on me to try to understand like, you know, where how can I understand and how can we accommodate?
I couldn't agree more, and I think what you've just discussed specifically about neurodivergence, but also about how we treat kids and how we treat each other, we've seen as reflected in the book and in our lives and in the news that maybe just being understanding is the best place to start, and to have an open ear and an open mind.
But also I think accepting that we cannot always be that understanding person, right? And that's okay. Like I think that if we expect ourselves to be all light and love and happiness all the time, we're going to be sorely disappointed and upset with ourselves.
Oh my gosh, that is like I just felt some walls kicked down in my brain, if that makes any sense, you know?
Yeah.
And to be okay with being on the journey to understanding. Hey, I might not understand right now, but I'm going to, you know, start stepping down that road to understanding. And then maybe people would stop being so hard on themselves. And I think when people are hard on themselves, that's when they can kind of retreat into that mental prison of, why do trans people always need to get their pronouns right? Why do I need to understand this, that, and that? Wow. I would like to, well, okay, before we wrap up, a question more about the book itself. I would like to hear, is there a specific part of the book that you most responded to emotionally? Can you name something that happened in the book where you had the biggest reaction, or maybe the biggest learning moment?
You know, I think for me, the reaction that stands out is the whole time I didn't go and look up to see how it had been resolved in the news or anything. So I'm reading the book and I'm thinking, when are they going to get to the restorative justice? When are they going to get to the restorative justice? They're going to do it. And then they never do it. And I felt so disappointed that they hadn't had that opportunity to do so, despite having mentioned so many times that they wanted some of the things that sort of a process could offer. But at the same time, like you were saying, I felt like the book itself was a piece of restorative. It showed what restorative justice is about, right? Because it shows the pain, it shows the healing, it shows the joy, it shows the laughter. All of this can coexist, and it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, that we can see all these layers and accept that that's just the way life is, that things aren't perfect and they don't have to be perfect. That, yeah.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I haven't gotten through the whole book yet, but I think that what I like, actually before even touching the book, trying to look it up, or I think Jacob maybe sent me a link, and it was, I'd say like, okay, who's the antagonist? And I think that's so interesting that it's labeled as an antagonist. And so, even hearing about, just the way the book is structured, it's very much not about like, okay, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, but really understanding all of the aspects, right? Like seeing them for who they are and knowing the backstory and all that they're experiencing. I think that's what's powerful, again, not seeing just the behavior itself. So I really like that.
Oh, yes. I think one of the moments from the book that I most had the biggest reaction to was that Richard had written a letter to Sasha asking for forgiveness. And that letter was kept from Sasha and their family because there was an admission of guilt within that letter. But without that admission of guilt, Sasha's family would have never been able to really move on, I think. So what that represented to me was how the legal system prevented any sort of actual emotional healing from occurring, just to I don't know why. I guess because the lawyer didn't want to lose the case and wanted to represent Richard properly. But Richard needed the family to hear him, and the family needed to hear Richard. And when boiled down in a pot, that's what really needed to happen. It's a feeling of frustration, but also a feeling of hope. Because it was like Richard did the thing that needed to be done if only people were given the chance to hear him.
It's like the distinction between like kind of the criminal justice system versus what restorative justice is focusing on.
Exactly. Giving voice to everyone that is involved in the process, right? And that's what we need, because when we only listen to one voice, we're never going to get the full story, and people are going to be dissatisfied at the end, right? You don't get that full healing.
Well, thank you guys so much for engaging with this with us. We delved into some kind of difficult topics, and the book makes you do that. And I just want to thank you guys for being a part of this journey and doing this work with us at the library, and hopefully for the community that we live in. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you, and thanks for recommending the book and having us read it. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was great.
Good.
Yeah, and thank you for this opportunity for, like you're saying, that community to be involved in doing some of this deep diving and reflection, right? I think it speaks to a lot of things we were referencing even in this conversation, right? Having opportunities to self-reflect, having opportunities for community engagement and how we can kind of shape the community. So I think this is where we're living it out.
We're living it out.
Part of it.
So thank you guys again. I will take this time to plug the Big Gay Read. Now, I think this video is going to come out after the author is coming to visit us at Ann Arbor District Library. But for those of you who have made it to this point in this video, if you haven't already, check out a copy of the 57 Bus. And if it just sits on your bedside and you think about it 2 or 3 times and you return the book, that is meaningful. So we just want you to, in some way, shape, form, or fashion, engage with the 57 Bus. So check out a copy from the library. Thank you guys again so much. I can't say thank you enough. So yeah, thank you, and thank you for watching.